The orphanage wasn't a home. It was a holding cell for the unwanted. Nestled on the edge of the industrial district, the building smelled perpetually of boiled cabbage and floor wax, a scent that stuck to the clothes of every child who lived there. Among the rowdy shouts and the chaotic energy of 50 children fighting for attention, there was one boy who seems to occupy no space at all. His name was Elias. Elias was 10 years old, skinny, with knobby knees and eyes that seemed too big for his face. He moved through the hallways like a shadow, hugging the walls, desperately trying to avoid notice. But in a place like St. Agnes, being quiet didn't make you safe, it made you a target. The head caretaker, Mr. Vance, was a man who believed that volume equaled value. He liked the loud boys, the ones who played rough, the ones who showed spirit. He had no patience for Elias. To Vance and the other staff, Elias was the mute, or more frequently, useless. He wasn't good at sports, he tripped over his own feet. He wasn't charming, he stuttered when he tried to speak to prospective parents. During chores, while other boys hauled coal or scrubbed floors with vigorous energy, Elias would get distracted, staring at the way dust motes danced in the light, or how the water drained in a spiral. Before we continue, if this story is resonating with you, consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like, and let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. I always read them. One freezing Tuesday in November, a pipe burst in the basement. It was chaos. Water was flooding the laundry room, threatening to ruin the winter blankets. Mr. Vance was shouting orders, red-faced and frantic. "Grab the buckets! Move! Move!" The boys scrambled, forming a bucket brigade. Elias tried to join in, picking up a heavy pail of water, but his grip was weak and his hands were shaking from the cold. He took 2 steps, slipped on the slick concrete, and went down. The bucket crashed, soaking Mr. Vance's shoes and trousers in icy, dirty water. The room went silent. The other boys snickered, hiding their smiles behind their hands. Mr. Vance looked down at Elias, who was sprawling in the puddle, shivering. The caretaker didn't yell. That would have been better. Instead, he just sighed, a long, heavy sound of pure disappointment. "Get up, Elias," Vance said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Just get out of the way. You're useless here. You're always useless." Vance gestured to a stronger boy, a bully named Carter, to take Elias's place. "Carter, handle this. At least someone here earns their keep." Elias scrambled to his feet, wet and humiliated, and ran. He didn't stop until he reached the attic, his sanctuary. He sat in the dark, hugging his knees, shivering violently. The word echoed in his head, useless. It wasn't just an insult anymore. It felt like a prophecy. He looked out the small, grime-streaked window at the city lights flickering in the distance. He wondered if the world outside was any different, or if he was simply broken, a piece of machinery that had been manufactured without a purpose. He didn't cry. He just watched the lights, specifically the red flashing lights of a distant siren wailing in the night, wondering what it felt like to be someone who was needed. Elias aged out of the orphanage at 18, with nothing but a trash bag of clothes and $40 in his pocket. The day he left, Mr. Vance didn't even look up from his paperwork. There were no goodbyes, no good lucks. He simply ceased to exist for them, just as he had always feared. For the first year, Elias drifted. He washed dishes in a diner, swept floors in a mechanic's shop, and slept in a cramped studio apartment that smelled worse than St. Agnes. The label useless followed him like a ghost. He kept his head down, spoke only when spoken to, and assumed that he was destined for a life of invisibility. Then came the summer of the heat wave. A brush fire started in the hills outside the city and began to encroach on the suburbs. Elias was walking home from his shift at the diner when he saw the smoke, thick black plumes choking the sky. He saw people running away, but then he saw a truck screaming toward the danger. It was a bright red engine, filled with men and women in heavy gear, their faces set with grim determination. Something in Elias's chest pulled tight. For his entire life, he had been the one running away, the one hiding in the attic. But watching those firefighters, he saw something he had never understood before: purpose. The next day, he walked into the Fire Academy recruitment office. The sergeant behind the desk looked at him skeptically. Elias was still lean, quiet, and unassuming. He didn't look like the hero type. "It's a grueling program, son," the sergeant warned. "Most people quit in the first week. It requires strength, yes, but mostly it requires you to stay calm when every instinct in your body is screaming at you to run." Elias thought about the attic. He thought about the years of silence, of watching, of enduring. "I don't run," Elias said softly. It was the first time he had spoken with absolute certainty. The training was hell. The physical demands were crushing. Elias vomited after drills. His muscles screamed in protest. But where the loud, confident recruits, the ones who reminded him of Carter, often panicked under the pressure of the live burn simulations, Elias thrived. His weakness at the orphanage, his tendency to observe, to be quiet, became his superpower. In a burning building, noise is the enemy. Panic kills. Elias learned that fire lived and breathed. He learned to listen to the crackle of timber before it gave way. He learned to read the color of the smoke to know what was burning. While others rushed in and made mistakes, Elias moved with a fluid, calculated precision. Captain Miller, a grizzled veteran who had seen it all, took notice during a high-rise drill. "You move like a ghost, kid," Miller told him, clapping a heavy hand on his shoulder. "You don't waste energy. You don't waste air. You're a natural." Elias looked at his reflection in the fire truck's window. He was wearing the turnout gear, the helmet, the mask. He looked bigger. He looked capable. The boy who couldn't carry a bucket of water was gone. In his place was a man who could carry a terrified victim down 3 flights of stairs without breaking his rhythm. He wasn't useless. He was a shield. And for the first time in his life, Elias realized that the silence he had lived in wasn't emptiness. It was the calm before the storm. He was ready. He just didn't know that his first true test would bring him face to face with the ghosts of his past. The firehouse was quiet, suspended in that heavy, thick silence that only exists between disasters. It was 2 a.m. on a Tuesday, 5 years since Elias had walked out of St. Agnes Orphanage. He sat in the common room, polishing his boots. It was a rhythmic, meditative motion. Small circles, wax on, wax off. The other firefighters were asleep in their bunks or dozing in the recliners, but Elias rarely slept well on shift. He preferred to be ready. He liked the stillness. It was the only time his mind wasn't analyzing exit routes or structural integrity. Then the klaxon shattered the peace. The lights snapped on, harsh and blinding. The dispatcher's voice crackled over the PA system, devoid of emotion, reciting coordinates that made Elias's blood run cold. Engine 54, ladder 12, structure fire, 800 block of Harrow Street, multiple calls, entrapment reported. Harrow Street. Elias froze for a fraction of a second, his hand hovering over his boot. That wasn't just a street, it was a scar on the map of his memory. It was the address of St. Agnes. He moved on autopilot, his training taking over where his emotions threatened to paralyze him. Within 60 seconds, he was in his turnout gear, the heavy Kevlar pants and jacket feeling like a second skin. He climbed into the back of the rig, the diesel engine roaring to life beneath him. As the truck peeled out of the station, sirens wailing, Elias stared out the window. The city blurred into streaks of neon and shadow, but his mind was traveling back in time. As they got closer, the smell hit him first. Even over the scent of diesel and the stale air of the cab, he could smell it, the acrid chemical tang of burning old wood and insulation. The sky ahead wasn't black, it was a bruising shade of orange. When the truck turned the final corner, the scene was straight out of a nightmare. It wasn't just a house fire, the entire block was threatened. The old textile warehouse next to the orphanage was fully engulfed, a towering inferno of rage. The wind was whipping the flames, feeding them, pushing them directly toward the crumbling brick facade of St. Agnes. Elias jumped off the truck before it came to a complete stop. The heat was a physical wall pressing against his face. The street was chaos. Neighbors were screaming, running in pajamas, clutching pets. But Elias's eyes were locked on the orphanage. The fire had jumped to the roof. The upper windows, the windows of the dormitory where he used to sleep, were glowing with a sinister red light. Captain Miller was already shouting orders. "We have civilians trapped on the 3rd floor. The stairwell is compromised. Elias, grab the Halligan. You're with me. We're going in for search and rescue." Elias grabbed the heavy steel bar, his grip iron tight. He looked up at the building that had been his prison. He saw faces pressed against the glass of the 3rd floor. He recognized the layout. He knew exactly which hallway led to that window. He knew which floorboards creaked. He knew the building's bones better than anyone. For a moment, he wasn't firefighter Elias. He was the scared boy in the attic. But then he snapped his mask into place, the regulator clicking with a hiss of compressed air. The sound of his own breathing filled his ears, steady, rhythmic, alive. The scared boy was gone. The professional had arrived. He charged toward the burning doors, running directly into the hell he had spent his whole life trying to escape. Inside, the world was smoke and noise. It was darker than night, a choking, swirling blackness illuminated only by the occasional flash of orange flame licking across the ceiling. The heat was oppressive, banking down from above, forcing Elias and Captain Miller to stay low. They moved in a crawl, knees scraping against the wet, debris-strewn floor. "Right-hand search pattern." Miller's voice crackled over the radio in Elias's ear. "Keep contact." Elias kept one hand on the wall, his senses dialed to 11. He could hear the building dying, the groan of timber stressing under the heat, the pop of glass shattering. This was the beast, and it was hungry. They reached the 2nd floor landing. The stairs leading up were a mess of burning debris, but they were passable. "Up," Elias signaled. He led the way now. He didn't need to see. He felt the memory of the stairs in his legs. He counted them. 1, 2, 3. Landing. Turn. When they breached the 3rd floor hallway, the heat was intense enough to blister skin even through the gear. The smoke was banked down to waist level. Elias scanned the darkness with his thermal imaging camera. The screen showed blobs of white heat everywhere, but then, near the end of the hall, near the office, he saw cooler shapes, huddled figures. "Victims located, Sector 3, Elias shouted into his mic. He crawled forward, moving with the eerie, fluid grace that had earned him his reputation. He reached the group. There were 4 of them, 3 terrifyingly young children clutching each other, and 1 adult man. The man was crouched in the corner, holding a wet rag over his mouth, his eyes wide with animalistic terror. He was coughing violently, his face smeared with soot, his composure completely shattered. It was Mr. Vance. The man who had once towered over Elias, the man who had called him useless, was now a trembling heap on the floor, paralyzed by fear. He looked up at the masked figure emerging from the smoke. He didn't see Elias. He saw a monster in black gear, a faceless entity with an axe and a tank. "Help us!" Vance screamed, his voice ragged. "We're trapped! The stairs are gone!" Elias stood up, his helmet grazing the smoke layer. He checked the integrity of the floor. It was spongy. Bad sign.
"Get the kids," Elias commanded, his voice distorted by the mask, sounding deep and mechanical. He grabbed Vance by the jacket, hauling the heavy man to his feet with a strength that shocked the caretaker. "Move, now!"
Vance stumbled, his legs giving way. "I can't! It's too hot! We can't go back that way!" Elias didn't have time to cowardice. He shoved Vance toward Captain Miller, who was grabbing two of the children. Elias scooped up the smallest child, a girl who couldn't have been more than 6. She buried her face in his turnout coat, sobbing. "We aren't going back the way we came," Elias said, looking at the window at the end of the hall. The fire had cut off their retreat. The stairs they had just climbed were now fully engulfed. They were cut off. The ceiling above them groaned, a deep cracking sound that vibrated through the soles of Elias's boots. The roof was coming down. "Captain, we're cut off," Elias barked. "We need a ladder to the north window ASAP." "Ladder 12 is extending, but they're 30 seconds out," Miller yelled back, coughing as smoke bypassed his seal. 30 seconds was a lifetime. The fire roared, blowing out the door to the dormitory behind them. A wave of superheated gas rolled over their heads. Vance screamed, dropping to the floor again, curling into a ball. "We're gonna die! We're gonna die here!" Elias looked at the man who had taught him that he was nothing. He looked at the man who had given up on him, and in that moment, Elias decided that nobody was giving up today. He grabbed Vance by the collar again, dragging him toward the window. He kicked the glass out, shattering it instantly. Cold night air rushed in, feeding the fire behind them, but offering a path out. "Stand up," Elias roared, his voice cutting through the panic. "You stand up and you hold on to me or you don't make it out. Do you understand?" Vance nodded frantically, terrified of the fire, but perhaps more terrified of the authority radiating from this unknown firefighter. Elias positioned himself between the fire and the victims, using his own body as a heat shield. He could feel the temperature rising on his back, the warning alarms on his air pack starting to chirp. He wasn't useless. He was a shield. And for the first time in his life, Elias realized that the silence he had lived in wasn't emptiness. It was the calm before the storm. He was ready. He just didn't know that his first true test would bring him face to face with the ghosts of his past. "Hold on," Elias whispered to the little girl in his arms. "I've got you." The tip of the aerial ladder slammed against the windowsill with a metallic clang that sounded like a church bell ringing in the apocalypse. It was the sweetest sound Elias had ever heard. Outside, the world was a blur of flashing lights and water streams, but inside, the room was rapidly becoming a blast furnace. The fire had chewed through the support beams of the ceiling, and fiery debris was beginning to rain down around them like meteors. "Go! Move!" Elias shoved Captain Miller toward the window. Miller, holding two of the children tight against his chest, climbed out onto the rungs, disappearing into the smoke-filled abyss of the night. That left Elias, the little girl clinging to his neck, and Mr. Vance. The caretaker was staring at the flames rolling across the ceiling, his eyes glazed over with a paralysis that Elias recognized. It was the same look the boys used to get right before a beating, total dissociation. "Vance!" Elias shouted, his voice booming through the diaphragm of his mask. He grabbed the man's shoulder, shaking him hard enough to rattle his teeth. "The floor is going. You have to climb." Vance looked at the window, then back at the fire. I can't," he stammered, coughing violently as the smoke grew thicker. "I can't do it. It's too high." The irony was bitter. This was the man who forced terrified children to scrub gutters on the roof without safety gear, shouting at them to be a man if they cried. Now, faced with his own mortality, he was a child. Elias heard the ominous crack-snap of the main joist above their heads. There was no time for a pep talk. Elias didn't treat him like a person anymore. He treated him like cargo. He grabbed the back of Vance's coat and physically manhandled him toward the window. "Get on the ladder or you burn," Elias roared. Fear finally hot-wired Vance's muscles. He scrambled out the window, his movements clumsy and frantic, clutching the rails of the ladder with a death grip. Elias followed instantly, stepping onto the rung just as the room behind them exploded. A massive whoosh of pressure blew out from the window, a tongue of fire licking at Elias's heels. The heat was intense, searing through the thick layers of his protective gear. He shielded the little girl with his body, curling around her as they began the descent.
The climb down was a blur of adrenaline. Above them, the orphanage roof finally gave way, collapsing inward with a thunderous crash that sent sparks shooting into the night sky like fireworks. The building where Elias had learned to be invisible was crumbling into dust and ash. Elias focused on his breathing. In, out. He focused on the weight of the girl in his arms, a life that would continue because he was there. He focused on Vance's boots on the rungs below him, ensuring the man didn't freeze and fall. When his boots finally touched the wet pavement of the street, Elias's legs burned with exertion, but he didn't stumble. Paramedics rushed forward immediately, swarming them. They pulled Vance away, wrapping him in a shock blanket and putting an oxygen mask over his soot-stained face. They took the little girl from Elias's arms. She didn't want to let go, her small fingers tangling in his turnout coat, but the medics needed to check her lungs. Elias stepped back, leaning against the side of the fire truck. He ripped the regulator off his face, gasping for the cool, clean air. He felt lightheaded, the adrenaline crash hitting him all at once. He watched the building burn, the flames reflecting in his dark eyes. It was over. He had done his job. The street was a chaotic symphony of radios, sirens, and shouting, but a strange pocket of silence seemed to form around the triage area where Mr. Vance sat. He was sitting on the back bumper of an ambulance, holding a bottle of water with shaking hands. He looked small. The imperious giant of Elias's childhood was gone, replaced by a gray, frightened old man wrapped in a foil blanket. Vance was looking around frantically, his eyes darting from firefighter to firefighter. He was asking the paramedics something, pointing toward the truck where Elias stood. He pushed the medic away and stood up, his legs wobbling, and walked over to where Elias was drinking water. Elias didn't turn away. He stood tall, holding his helmet under his arm, his face streaked with soot and sweat, his hair matted against his forehead. Vance stopped 3 feet away. He looked at the gear, the badge number, the Rescue 1 patch. Then he looked up at the face. For a long moment there was no recognition. Vance was looking for a stranger, a hero, a faceless savior. But then he saw the eyes. Large, dark, observant eyes. He saw the scar on the chin, a scar from the time Elias had tripped carrying a crate of milk, and Vance had left him bleeding on the floor for an hour to teach him a lesson. Vance's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He blinked, rubbing his eyes as if trying to clear away a hallucination. "Elias?" he whispered. The name sounded foreign in his mouth, lacking the venom it had carried for a decade. Elias took a slow sip of water, screwing the cap back on the bottle. "Mr. Vance," he replied, his voice calm, steady, and deep. Vance shook his head in disbelief. He looked at the burning ruin of St. Agnes, then back at the man standing before him, a man radiating strength, competence, and authority. You pulled me out?" he stammered. "You saved us? I thought you were—" "Useless?" Elias finished the sentence for him. He didn't say it with anger. He didn't shout it. He said it with a quiet, devastating matter-of-factness. Vance flinched as if he'd been slapped. He looked down at his own trembling hands, then up at Elias, shame flooding his face. The realization of who he owed his life to was a heavier burden than the smoke in his lungs. He had thrown this boy away. He had crushed him, ignored him, and labeled him as nothing. And yet, when the fire came, the useless boy was the only one who hadn't run. I don't know what to say," Vance choked out, tears cutting tracks through the soot on his cheeks. "Thank you. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Elias looked at him, really looked at him, and realized that he felt nothing. No hatred, no need for revenge. The monster was just a sad old man. The anger that Elias thought would consume him had burned away in the fire, leaving only clarity. "You were right about one thing," Elias said, stepping closer, his shadow falling over Vance. "I wasn't built for that place. I wasn't built to be quiet. He looked over at Captain Miller, who was waving him over to help pack up the gear. But you were wrong about the rest. I was never useless. I was just waiting for the right fire. He didn't wait for a response. He didn't need Vance's apology, and he certainly didn't need his validation. That debt was paid. Elias turned his back on the caretaker and walked toward his crew, his brothers and sisters who knew his true worth. As he climbed back into the truck, Elias took one last look at the charred remains of the orphanage. The attic window was gone. The ghosts were gone. The siren wailed, signaling their departure, but to Elias, it sounded like a victory song. He wasn't the boy in the window anymore. He was the man driving the engine, ready for the next call.
If this story meant something to you, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. That way, you won't miss the next stories of resilience and survival we'll be sharing here.